Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of Blab It. We are fortunate to have Faith Jones on here with us to talk a lot about the no BS business and things that business owners should know about legalities. For those of you joining us for the first time, my name is Glenn Ingram. I've been working in coaching, mentoring, and helping people become better communicators to increase their sales aptitude. Paul, how are you today?
I'm doing very well, Glenn. Thank you, sir. My name is Paul Geiger. I am a New York City public speaking coach and presentation expert. And I help people once they have that mindset clarity to be able to deliver that message to all four corners of their compass, to their superiors, their direct reports, their peers, and their customers. And we have a special guest with us here this week, Faith. Why don't you let everybody know who you are?
Hi, my name is Faith Jones. I am a international corporate attorney. I've worked for some of the biggest law firms in the world doing billion-dollar deals, and then I decided to switch and work with smaller companies, smaller firms. So I've pretty much run the entire gamut of the corporate legal industry. And I know I look young, but I've been a lawyer since 2008. But I'm also an author. And as you can see, I have a framework behind me. I did a TEDx talk, and I'm an author of 2 books, one of which is coming out in November. So I keep myself busy. And one of the things that I guess is my superpower is to take complex, difficult concepts and really boil it down into its most core concepts so that people can get a real clear grasp of it. So I take difficult things and I make them simple. And I firmly believe that each person, especially each business owner, needs to be empowered to understand this stuff for themselves, because you really, if you don't know the basics, then you are just at the mercy of everybody else. And you're not even going to know if the advisors that you're getting are any good. So it's really the responsibility of each person to understand things for themselves. And that's why I try to make it really simple. My goal is that you guys can be empowered to handle your own, to handle a lot of your own legal stuff, or at least to really know what you're talking about when you're talking to a legal advisor.
Well, thank you very much for joining us, Faith. I'd like to start off with a question from a course of yours that I was lucky enough for you to share with me about a year ago, talking to small business owners. So for someone that's newer in small business, or maybe starting a business for the first time, what are some of the first things that you would suggest, or maybe some of the first landmines typically, or mistakes that business owners make when starting a new business?
Thanks, Glenn. Well, I'd say that some years ago, my mother joined a group of entrepreneurs who were all marketers, and she calls me up one day and she says, "Oh, these guys are great. You know, they're out there, they're building businesses, but boy, they are going to be in trouble because none of them know the first thing about companies. They're all just out there like selling stuff unprotected, you know." And she's like, "You got to do something. You got to help." And I said, "Well, boy, they really can't afford me, and I don't have the time to talk to all these small businesses and, you know, give them a big fat legal bill." So I took the time to create a course called the No BS Business Structure. And in it, I focused on, I said, what are the first 2 things, just the bare minimum that any business owner needs to get started to really protect themselves, and not just to protect themselves, but to give them a professionalism, right? When you're going out into the marketplace and you're selling your skills, you're selling your business, there is a professionalism that exists that people will respect you more and be more inclined to purchase from you when you have a couple things in place. Then they'll be like, "Oh, this is a real company," right? So that's what I created that course for. And the first 2 things that I speak to people about that you need to have when you first form your business is form a business entity and have a client contract. Whatever type of service you're providing, you need to have a contract for that service. And the 2 things, the business entity and the client contract, They act both as a shield against people who might come at you to attack you, but especially the contract also can be your sword, your weapon, if you need to go out and you need to enforce payment, right? Or your client's trying to change the deal on you. So there's just a wealth of information in that course. Basically, what I did is I broke down a contract. I take a simple contract that I've written and I break down all those strange provisions and I say, this is how they work in the real world, right? Because if you don't understand why that's in a contract, then somebody else is going to use it against you instead of you being able to use it to defend yourself. So those are the two things that I go through. And one of the things that I found when I first did this course, and like my first 20 students came into the group was, and I was actually shocked by this, okay? And it was that probably about half the class had already opened their own company. They had formed some type of company, some kind of entity, and usually with advice. They had gone to a provider and someone had advised them and helped them set it up, whether, they set up different types of companies. And I was just shocked when I saw that every single one of them who had a company, they had either set it up in the wrong jurisdiction, in the wrong state for them, or they had set up the wrong type of entity for them, for their type of business and what they wanted to do. And it was just amazing to me. I was like, who are these people giving these guys this advice, right? What is happening? And, people go to different services, or sometimes they would go, oh, my so-and-so recommended this attorney or whatever, right? And it turned out it wasn't the right thing for them. So what I did is that I reviewed all the different jurisdictions and I said, these are the jurisdictions that are good for this. And this is how you think about what you're going to have in a jurisdiction, about why you'd be in one versus another, right? And so that is a really key important part when you're forming your company, and also to understand the tax implications of the company, because that's really what it's about, right? And if you don't understand what that is, you're going to form an entity that ends up costing you more than it should.
Well, you know what, Faith, just clarify certainly for me and for everyone else who's watching this, when you say jurisdiction, what is it that we're talking about? Are we talking about state restrictions? Are we talking about categorization? What are you talking about when you say jurisdiction? Because it sounds like you want to be in the right place. You certainly don't want to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. So if you could clarify that for us.
Yeah, so your jurisdiction is the state that you form your company in. And different states have different rules and regulations and different tax structures on different types of companies. So you want to understand which states tax in which ways. If something like privacy is important to you, so this is another thing I talk about, is your privacy, right? You don't necessarily want to have your personal name and address on all of these public documents, right? Where anybody can just go look it up. Because then if they want to sue you, or if they, especially like a false claim, right? That we do have issues of this where there people create these false claims and go after you and sue you, even though you didn't do anything wrong. It makes it very easy for them to find you, to find your assets, and to get at you. Versus, and the whole point of a company is to protect you from that. So some states allow you to keep that private, that information private, and other states require that you put that information out in a public, out on the Secretary of State's website. So when you're talking about jurisdiction, as far as which state you form in, some of the critical things are the tax consequences of that state and their privacy laws, and whether or not those states are more rigorous in protecting the business owner from liability. So those are the key three things you're looking at when you're picking a jurisdiction for where you form your company. And then you also need to understand what's called nexus, right? So there are some really critical aspects of picking that. It's not just, oh, well, so-and-so said make it here, so I'm going to make it there, right? And the other interesting thing is there are places where that used to be good. There are states that used to be good. But so everybody thinks of them as like, oh, this is the place to form, right? Like for a lot of people, it was Nevada. But since then, the state has changed its laws. And so it's not as good a jurisdiction as other states now. So that's another thing that people have to be aware of. And that's why you need to have this kind of overview and understand how to think about it. It's actually a lot more complex than people think. When I went into this, I actually took a long time to research all of this to put it together into the course, because, you know, when I was doing billion-dollar deals, I never had to think about it or worry about that. You know, everybody formed in Delaware, and the company was already formed before I got to the, you know, the M&A deal.
Sure.
So it's just thing that a lot of lawyers don't really think about from an overall perspective. They just
Okay.
focus on their own personal jurisdiction.
Well, I know what's going through everybody's mind right now, and I don't want to use the words best and worst, but let's just give us an example of most restrictive and least restrictive. Just one state that you know of off the top of your head, doesn't have to be the most, but one of the least restrictive and one of the most restrictive, just as an FYI for our audience.
So I think California is probably one of the worst that you could form your company in. It is very restrictive. The annual tax just for having an LLC open is $800, so it's expensive. And just the whole labor laws and everything there are very restrictive. And as far as one of the best, I mean, people think of Delaware. Delaware is good, but it is also more expensive. So at this point, Wyoming is actually one of the best states to form in. And it's only, the annual fee is only, I think they just raised it to $60 a year. And it has very good regulation. It doesn't tax businesses. But the reason you have to watch the course is because you also have to think about where you're located. So there are states that are, if you're actually in that state, then it's better just to form in that state, like Florida or Texas, right? If you're living there, if you're connected to it, that's great. It's good enough. You can form there. So there's factors to think about, including where you personally run the business from, which is important. So if you actually run your business out of California, you can't really escape it, right? But if you're a mobile business and you are an entrepreneur that can work online and can work from anywhere, then, you know, you have more flexibility.
So it seems like marketers need to do what they are always asking their clients to do and not look at this as an expense, but an investment, because just because it's cheaper to form an LLC in state A, it may be a lot better for you and more beneficial to have an S Corp or an LLC that's running an S Corp out of a different state. It may cost you a little bit of money initially, but save you a whole lot more on the backside.
Yeah, it's a possibility. It's definitely a possibility. And the other thing I talk about is, you know, the difference between when you'd want to form an S Corp versus an LLC, right? LLCs are generally the better option. And because there's a lot of restrictions that come with S Corps, and I go into that. So you have to really think about that. And then kind of when is the transition time to think about being, if you might want to switch over to be taxed as an S Corp or not. A lot of accountants automatically recommend S Corps when they would not be the best thing for that client. And they might eventually be good for that client, but not at the point that they're at early on. So that's another thing to think about as well. One of the things I thought might be fun to show you is a few slides I created for a presentation I did a while back. And, you know, it's just an example of me trying to kind of take these difficult concepts, the concept of a company, right? What does it mean? It's a legal entity, and, you know, it has its own rights, and it can sue and it can be sued. And, you know, it just doesn't make sense because people just think of it as like, it's a piece of paper I got, right? Right? That's what they say. It's a company and this is a piece of paper, right? What does it do, right? They have no idea what it's really for. And so one of the principles that I try to share is, you may not be able to, you can't protect yourself against anything. I cannot tell you that if you form in this way and do this and have that, nobody will ever sue you, right? Because frivolous lawsuits, people can sue you for anything, right? But what you want to do is you want to put yourself in a position where you are a very unattractive target, okay? Where if the person goes to their lawyer and is like, I want to sue them for this, that, and the other, the lawyer will look at, your contract, will look at the company, will look at and he will say, well, it's really not worth my time to sue them because we're not going to get enough money to even pay me, much less get you anything, right? So that's how you want to structure your company, and your contract can do that for you. It can limit your liability in a very significant way. So I show that in the course as well. I teach you how to write those provisions so that your liability is limited, so that you become a very unattractive source or a very unattractive target, right? And the same is true of your company. So let's take a look at what your company actually does for you. I created some kind of fun slides here. So, all right. So if you guys want to find me, I'm at faithjones.com. Now, this slide shows, I like to typify your business as like a robot, because people think, well, it's my business, but I'm the CEO and I do all the things. So how is this separate from me, right? They can't conceptualize how a business is an entity that's separate from them as a person. So if you think about your business like your battle robot, okay, that's what your business is. And when you transact using your business, it's like you're sitting there at the controls, controlling the robot, and the robot's going around and doing all the different stuff for the business, loading carts and, driving the business car, whatever it is, right? That's your robot is the business entity that's acting on your behalf. That's how you can think about it. So in your business, you have business assets, right? You have the equipment, maybe you have a lease for your business, you have business bank accounts. You should have business bank accounts. That's one of the most important things that creates this limited liability, right? And then on the other side, you have you as an individual, right? Maybe you have your personal home, your car, you have your personal savings accounts, you have your retirement accounts, other things like that. And so what having a company does is it creates a wall between your business assets and you, right? So what happens is that you want your business to be the one to sign the contracts, because then the business, if something goes wrong, right, then let's say your business has issues. Boy, a lot of businesses sure did in 2020, didn't they? Maybe you weren't able to pay your lease on your business property or whatever happened, right? You have creditors, lawsuits coming after you. The company is in front of you. So the creditors have to go after the company. They can't go after you as an individual, right? And so even if the worst thing happens, right? Let's say the creditors come after you and they shoot your poor little robot dead, okay? But that robot was protecting you. So even if they force the company to declare bankruptcy, right? And the company assets are wiped out, that's not your personal assets. So you are still protected as an individual, your personal bank accounts, your personal home, right? All of that stuff. Only the stuff that was in the business entity can be taken out by your creditors or by a lawsuit. So that is the really, really key thing. And you can pick what goes in that business and what stays on the other side of that wall. So that is how you protect it. This is a kind of funny thing. I go through the differences between the S Corps and C Corp and LLC, right? But that's a couple quick slides just to kind of show you a different way to think about how you use your business, and how, hopefully that's helpful for you. I don't know. Do you guys think that's helpful?
Yes.
Without a doubt, I think that, well, let me just ask you this. So you're saying that either way, if you have a contract, if you're providing a service or you're delivering product, whatever it is, if you sign it as an individual, you're liable. But if you sign it as a representative of your company, then you're not necessarily as liable. Is that correct?
Then the company is.
Then the company is. Yeah,
right.
You're just a representative.
Not you as an individual. So when you sign that company agreement, right, you sign it as, Wow Marketing, LLC or whatever, and then you put your name, CEO. Okay, that's how you sign the contract. So it's your company signing the contract. So if your company fails to deliver the service, or if somebody wants to sue you for that, they have to sue the company. They can't sue you as the individual. They have to sue your company first.
So let me ask you a question with that, from a couple different reasons, but primarily from a friend of mine that has some property in California that they were leasing for a brick and mortar business, that the client was the landlord requested a personal guarantor. So how do you deal with someone that wants a personal guarantee for a contract instead of letting the business be responsible because they've gone through this before?
Yeah, so you definitely want to avoid having to give a personal guarantee. And that's a situation where you're saying, I'm on the hook as an individual, not just the company, right? So when people ask for that, you want to push back for sure. You don't want to go along with that. In the long run, you have to decide how important that contract is to you as to whether or not you want to give them that personal guarantee, but you need to understand what that's doing because you're putting the rest of your assets at risk. So there's a couple things there's many things I do. I also have a group called Financial Ninjas. And one of the things that I'm going to be putting out there is a way for people to build their personal business EIN credit. A lot of businesses don't know how to do this. There's a very specific structure. There's kind of a whole hidden back end that you have to do, and you have to access the right credit people. And so there is a way you can do this where you can build a lot of business credit on the business EIN, which will be completely separate from your personal, like, social security number, right? Your personal credit score. And that is so important for you as a business. And that would help in a situation like that, because if you have a really good business credit, then they often won't ask for a personal guarantee. If you don't, then they often will ask for a personal guarantee. So that's one of the ways you can deal with that. Another one of the things we do, if you get into a little more complex structure, but you need to have, you're starting to look at, at least having a few $100,000 in assets and stuff is, there's a whole other structure for taxes that we can get into. That's really exciting. I know you say taxes is not generally exciting, but it is exciting when you can save on them.
Now, what about somebody who has a job, works for another company, but has a side hustle going on, a side business that they get income from? Are you saying 100% of the time that you should have this protection in place, even if it's sort of a part-time income generator?
This is what I would say. For some people, maybe, let's say if they haven't gotten any income, they're really just trying to figure out how to start a business. They haven't gotten paid at all yet, right? Then maybe you wait until you get your first payment in the door. You got to know you can actually do a business, okay? And a lot of people never get past that first sale. They put all this time, and they study all these courses, and they do all this training, and they create websites, and they never get their first sale, sadly, okay? So, it's fine if you want to wait until you make your first sale just to see, can I do this? But the money from your first sale, at least, should absolutely go to setting up a business entity, and making sure you have this stuff with this client contract. Even your first sale, like when you make the sale, then go quick, get the contract and get them to sign it, right? Because you can put a lot of provisions to protect yourself into the contract. So if you don't have a company, then make sure you have a really, really good contract, really well-drafted contract, because that can offer you protections, but it's still not as much as a company and the contract together, right? So if you are actually making income, if you're making regular money, regular income, then highly recommend you open a business. It is not that expensive to form a business. In my course, I literally teach you how to do it with a registered agent. And so I'm not telling you, like, you have to come to me and I'm going to form your company and I'm going to charge you, $1,500 or $2,000 or whatever. I'm like, there's a registered agent. These are the guys I use, $100, and they'll form your company for you. Okay, and so it's really very simple to set up, and it's not that expensive. And I do walkthroughs. I did like live walkthroughs with people on exactly what each question they ask on the form when you're opening your company, what it means and what to put there. So it is really just a few questions, but it does stump people because there's stuff people don't know, like what's a registered agent and stuff. So I explain to people exactly what you put in each of those questions and how to do it for themselves. So you can set it up for yourself. Just hire a registered agent for $100 and they can do it for you. But you have to know what you want, what jurisdiction, and you have to tell them. You can't expect them to know what's the right thing for you.
Okay.
So
I have a question.
It's not expensive, and I don't want people to feel like it's scary. It's actually really simple to do it. Just know that if you are getting an income from a side hustle, you don't want to jeopardize all of your income that you're getting from your other business. And the really exciting part about having a separate business like this is you can take huge tax deductions. Okay, when you have a side hustle, one of the best things, even if your side hustle isn't making you a lot of money, you can actually make it make you money by taking the right tax deductions.
Well, I have one question about a contract, but I want to make one statement about your registered agents, and that's asking them if they're actually registered in that state. So let's say you're doing something in Wyoming, or are they hiring a third-party agent over there? Speaking from someone with experience, that all of a sudden my entities weren't registered anymore because the third party never billed me because they didn't have my contact information. So that was something I learned the hard way a few years back.
Yes.
Anywho.
So the registered agent that I use and that I recommend, it has its own physical office in all 50 states.
Okay.
And that is 100%. That's a very important point. And a lot of times if you go find someone, you just don't know if they're going to be there tomorrow, right? And a lot of times they might be, like you said, they're just subbing it out to somebody else and they disappear and the other person doesn't know. So I use a registered agent that has a physical office in every state, and you can actually use their address too.
All right. I have a question, Glenn, if you don't mind, and it just.
All right, I'll wait. Go ahead.
The idea, what Faith had said about subbing it out. And this is a topic, Glenn, that you and we've been discussing on quite a few episodes of Blab It, and that is working with subcontractors. Now, we'll obviously talk about as there's a progression here as your company gets bigger and bigger. What are the legal hurdles? What are the legal first steps you should take? Is there a good proactive step to take if your side hustle, or even you've decided to make it your full-time job, starts to take on subcontractors? Is there some legalese? Is there some protection that you recommend for companies that are going through that sort of growth period?
Absolutely. The second most important contract that you need after you have your client contract is an independent contractor contract. So anytime you're taking on subcontractors or you're hiring out part of the work you're doing to somebody else to do, you're bringing them on as an independent contractor. And when you're doing that, you absolutely need to have a very clear agreement with that independent contractor. And I can't go into all the details of what needs to be in that agreement, but it needs to be very clear as to, exactly what their responsibilities are. So you can say, if you're not fulfilling them, you're out, right? You need to be clear about that. People don't think about it. They don't list it. And the other thing is key in that agreement is a provision about intellectual property, that everything that subcontractor does, that intellect is done as a work for hire, and that intellectual property belongs to you. Now, there is those type of provisions in the original contract with you and the client, okay? But they need to be much more strict in the contract with you and your independent contractor, because you want them to understand that, like, if they're, let's say you're hiring out, somebody's creating a bunch of Facebook posts, right? They're doing all the graphics for your client, or, they're doing, whatever that is. You want to make sure that you, and then therefore the client, are the owner of the copyright to all of that stuff. So your intellectual property provisions in your independent contractor is very important. And and then there's also limitation of liability, who's responsible for what if they mess up, right? So that there's a lot of really key things that have to go into an independent contractor contract when you bring people on.
Mhm.
If we could bounce back to your client contract, what are your opinions on, and what are maybe some pros and cons about having a mediation clause to limit exposure or limit how much it's going to cost you, and maybe limit some being sued for different reasons?
So that is a good question. I mean, one of the ways you limit your exposure is by using the right jurisdiction in the contract, which I talk about. But a mediation clause is a tricky one. So I have a longtime friend who is a litigator, and he hates mediation clauses because he likes to be able to go straight to the court and get what he wants, right? It used to be that mediation clauses were more helpful, but that is not the case as much anymore. They put them a lot in like insurance contracts or large company contracts because they know that they have the money, because in a mediation you have to hire the mediator. So it's not that it's going to be cheaper necessarily. You have to hire the mediator. Both sides typically still hire attorneys for this. Versus if it's a small amount of money, like under $10,000, you can just show up into small claims court and deal with it. You don't have to have a lawyer. You're not paying the judge, right? So if it's likely to be a smaller amount of money in the dispute, it is actually cheaper just to use the direct system than like small claims court, because the arbitration process, like I said, you have to go through arbitration committee. Both of you have to agree to an arbitrator. You have to hire them. You have to spend money to hire them. They're not necessarily cheap. Oftentimes you're still hiring attorneys. You're still paying for all that time going through that whole process with the arbitration. So it's not necessarily helpful. Whether it would make people less likely to bother with a lawsuit, that would be where it could potentially be helpful. The way I see it is that all of these provisions, they work together to make people less likely to want to bother to sue you, right? So by limiting your liability in that provision, by choosing your jurisdiction, right? By choosing how they can be sued, whether that's direct in the courts or whether that is through arbitration, all of these work to make you a less attractive target, right? They're like, if I'm limited to the amount that I can get in a lawsuit just to like whatever I've paid you for the work you've done for me, that might be $3,000. Well, it's definitely not worth it getting into a lawsuit over $3,000, because you're going to spend 20 or 60 to get that $3,000, right? So by limiting that in your contract, you can make yourself much less, and by limiting it with your company, you'll make it much less attractive. So that's how to think about it. Whether you think arbitration is the way to go, or going through the court system, there's less advantage to arbitration now than there used to be, I would say.
So with that said, any business, small or large, how often should they go over that contract, every year, every couple of years, to amend it based on other rulings, different things like that, to make sure that it's current and not 10 years ago or whatever, or whatever that term was, when arbitration was more popular or more of a viable option than currently?
I mean, your contract should be something that you know intimately. It is something that every business owner really needs to understand. You should not be using a contract that you don't fully understand each provision in it and know exactly what it means. So that's why I drafted a simplified contract in my course that you can use as a client contract, and I explain every single line and provision, because you need to know exactly what's in your contract. You get some 10-page contract from an attorney that you don't read and you give it to someone to sign, you're not doing your job as a business owner. So how many times should you go over that contract? Well, once you watch my contracts course, I remember a friend of mine, you know him, Fletch, when he watched it, he went and he was like, I've been in business 10 years. And all of a sudden I was like, crap, I need to go redo all my contracts.
Yeah, reason I was
So,
asking you is the same attorneys that have maintained mine for years were actually my first client a decade ago. And some of the things they've changed over the last few years, I know, is that they had the ability to email versus snail mail and just little things like that, that because of, X, Y, and Z case of happening, now they've opened up different availabilities for contacts and stuff like that. So I always try and have my contract gone over at least every 2 years, if not every year, and just was trying to give other business owners a good rule of thumb.
yeah, I mean, I'd say definitely, every couple years at least. But you're going to need to do it more than that if you're using that contract all the time, because stuff is going to come up in your interactions with clients and you're going to be like, oh, I need to add that into my contract. That's how contracts grow, right? Some client gives you a hassle about something. You're like, oh, I better put that point in my contract, right? So contracts are living documents that get updated because they are explaining how you do business. They are a living document. It's not just some dead piece of paper. So that's, I think, why you absolutely, a good businessman is updating their contract regularly because things change.
So with that, let me ask one last question, Paul, then I'll get out of the way. Just
Sure.
because I've had so many of our good friends in the marketing industry having issues with breaking up. It's always fun when we start dating and start a business relationship, but the breakup part isn't the funnest part. And it's hard to get some of them to understand that, you may as well address it up front when everyone's in a good mood and have breakup in your contract so that they know exactly, if we're not going to work anymore together, this is what we have to go through and stuff like that. So, what's your opinion about having how the contract is exited as well as entered, all written up when you originally signed something with a potential contract or client?
Absolutely. I mean, and any good contract is going to have that. You absolutely. Now, at first, I wasn't sure if you were talking about people getting together to work together, like partnerships or independent contractors, or when you're doing it with a client. But absolutely, your client contract needs to state very clearly how you break up, how much notice you give the person if you're going to separate, what are the payment terms for work already done. Like, all of those are critical. One of the most critical provisions is the no refund provision, right? Especially if you're providing services. So there are a lot of really key provisions about the breakup process that if you have them in the contract, the people who have used my contract, they come back to me and they're like, boy, you actually saved my client relationship with that contract, because the client was asking for something that wasn't in the contract, or they wanted to, they're demanding refund on something. And the guy took them and said, this is the provision in the contract you signed. And the person read it and was like, oh, okay. And that dispute was done, right? So when you list it really clearly, you can save oftentimes a client relationship, not just keep them from suing you or attacking you, but you can actually help that to continue. Or they'll just be like, okay, and walk away because it's in the contract, right? So those provisions are critical for sure.
All right. My mind keeps racing ahead, and I just watch this growing, and the idea of, we went through starting a business. We didn't really talk about taking on partnerships, but that's a whole nother Blabbit episode. We did talk about a little bit about having subcontractors. What if you get to the stage where you actually have some employees? And I think most specifically, what are the legal ramifications or the legal first steps you should take to maintain a balanced and, I guess, safe workplace for everyone?
That's a great question, Paul. So my specialty, I don't do labor law specifically, which is how do I hire and fire and, workers' compensation and stuff like that. However, there is an area that I do focus on, which is kind of company culture, ethics, and especially topics around like discrimination, sexual harassment, and stuff like that. So that is something that I do teach about, which is how do we really think about those principles in a way that creates a positive environment for us as individuals. sadly, a lot of the sexual harassment training, in fact, I just wrote a white paper on it about how sexual harassment, they did a huge study with the EEOC, and sexual harassment claims have maintained an average of about 30,000 a year for like the last 15 years. Now, you would think that they would go down when 90% of companies are supposed to be, do show sexual harassment training. But it is, the training itself is deeply flawed, I think. I don't know if any of you guys have ever had to sit through it, but I did. And, by the end, I remember as a young attorney and I was just more confused. So a lot of it is just designed to protect the butt of the company and not necessarily to really teach people the accurate principles of how we operate. So that's a lot of what this framework that you can see behind me here, right? And the TEDx talk I did, it's talking a lot about that. How do we understand the core of ethics, like I said, the 8 golden principles, right? Where if I want to have a truly high-performing ethical business where people feel valued and they're not being violated, and they understand how they're going to act towards me, right? This whole concept of the exchange, right? When I'm an employee, I have to know really clearly what are my responsibilities, right? What am I expected to provide in exchange for that? What am I not expected to provide? So those are the principles that underlie and any kind of ethics in a corporation, right? Where we say what the first right that I have, right? My primary right as a human is my property right in my own body. That is my very first core right. And that begins with the whole discussion of how do I know why are things wrong, right? If I didn't have a property right in my body, then murder wouldn't be wrong. There would be no standard for it, slavery, right? The reason that we understand slavery is wrong is because no one else can own my body, right? No other entity. I have a consciousness, I have an awareness, my spirit, whatever you want to call it, that owns this body. So no other human being can own your body. That is our first primary right. And when the founding fathers said, I have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that's what they were trying to express. They didn't quite, they didn't have the simplicity of this to express it, but that's what they were trying to say. The king doesn't own me. He can't just kill me. He can't just take my stuff, right? So that's the foundation. And a lot of times when we are experiencing discrimination against people of different races, or oftentimes particularly against women as well, it is coming from a subconscious historical perspective of those demographics as property. So therefore being a subcategory, right? So your purpose is to serve. You don't get as good as we do because you're sort of at a lower level, right? And it was because historically women and people of color were considered property, right? Now those laws have been changed, but the other underlying subconscious messages of society still linger. And that is what we have to change through those understanding this core principle that each human, man, woman, and child, has a full property right in their own body. And there are things that we do not do to them because we have to respect that property right, right? So for instance, touching somebody in an inappropriate way, a lot of times, and I would hear this literally like not 10 years ago, right? Somebody wanted to grab your butt or something, and they'd be like, well, I didn't hurt you, you're not harmed. And that would be the attitude that, you had to hurt somebody in order for something to be wrong. And when I realized this, I was like, no, you don't take my wallet just because it's sitting there, right? You're not going to go jump in my car and take it for a joyride. This is my property. You don't even get to touch it if I don't give you permission, or that violates my property right. You see? So when we start from that perspective of seeing each person as having a full property right in their own body, then we understand that what they create is also their property, right? And that's why we create our creations. And then I can make an exchange. There's the 5 principles of a deal. Once I own something, I make a deal. That's what contracts are all about, every business relationship. And I teach you the 5 principles that make a valid deal. And when you understand those, you will make sure that your contracts are iron solid, and you will understand the whole foundation principles behind what a contract is and what it does. And the truth is, it's any kind of agreement, even our relationships with our friends, our relationships with our significant other, they all come down to this concept of exchange. What is a real value exchange between two people? And how are we doing it in a healthy way? So when you understand that and you have those core principles in your company, then it just shifts the dynamic. You can talk about things principle based, not like, well, you did that and you did that and you know, right? You can be like, well, these are the principles, these are the parameters that we follow, right? If you're taking company property, right, that's stealing, because we understand that there's only like a few clear principles, and that's all you have to remember. It doesn't have to be this long list of, corporate ethics. You can just have a few clear principles, and then, if you violate any one of those, you're violating the foundation of what the law is built on. So it makes it much simpler. I literally can teach this to an 8-year-old and they get it.
Yeah, I do like the simplification of all of that. It makes a lot of sense. Everything else grows out from there, because again, when you talk about legalities or what is right or what is just, it seems like an incredibly complex and detailed conversation, whereas really, you're right, it just comes down to a couple of principles, and many different scenarios can come out of that, but they all come back to these principles.
Exactly. And the reason I like speaking from these principles is that, let's say something does come up in your company. You can sit down and work through it based on the principles. You don't have to know the answer to every single thing ahead of time. You can look at it through the principles and find the solution. So it gives you, it's like a tool you can use.
Well, it's nice. It's like, well, what are we really talking about? It really comes down to that simplification of what we're really talking about here is this. Let's not muddy it up with too many details or opinions. We've come to an agreement about these basic principles.
Exactly. Makes life much simpler.
Well, and a lot of times we hear about sexual harassment, but basically harassment these days is harassment, whether it be, opposite sex, same sex, or things like this. Wouldn't it be better to kind of teach people reactions and how to identify when someone's uncomfortable? Quick story. I was at a restaurant a couple weeks ago. They seated us. And all of a sudden, this guy was kind of upset. He looked over at me and he was like, "You're at our table." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" I went over talking to him. I was like, "Well, we had a reservation. They set you at our table." I said, "Okay, I'll go somewhere else." And he was saying no, he was upset because they skipped over him. He was going somewhere else. And I'm kind of a person that if someone's upset, I touch a shoulder, I touch a back, just to kind of calm the situation. And I realized real quickly he wasn't comfortable by me touching his back. And so I stopped. I realized he was in an uncomfortable position because he was mad at something else. And so I recognized his reaction and I stopped. Where in a work environment, that could be considered harassment. So don't we kind of need to train people how to understand and how to interpret when someone feels uncomfortable?
Yeah, and I think there's even an easier way to do it than that, which, I mean, of course it is good. I think if people can become more aware, and that's something we should be teaching in children, right? Noticing reactions and becoming aware of that. But what I try to teach is when you understand the 5 principles of an exchange, of a contract, anytime you're dealing with 2 people, these are existing, right? The first is an offer. I make an offer, and the other person has to accept that offer willingly, without pressure. Okay. So I was trying to teach this to a friend of mine who loved giving hugs, right? And he loved to just jump in there and just grab you and like hug you. And of course, he had all the best motives. But, there are some people who are not comfortable with that. Some women, perhaps they've been abused. You're never going to know that, they're not going to tell you, and they might be uncomfortable being touched. And another situation, right, is like an Orthodox Jewish rabbi. he can't be touched by a woman. You can't shake his hand, right? That's part of his religion. That's part of his faith. And if he says, no, I can't be touched by a woman who's not my wife, right? Some of us, we might look at it and be like, oh, well, he's just being, discriminatory and this and that and the other. But I look at it and I say, well, that's his body. He has the absolute right to say who can touch it and who doesn't, right? So why should that bother me, right? That's his body, okay? And so what I was trying to share with him is that instead of just assuming that it's okay from his cultural perspective to just grab somebody or touch them, to make an offer, right? So if he's approaching somebody he'd like to hug, just open your arms up to them and just open your arms. And if they come into your arms, then they are accepting the offer of being hugged instead of just grabbing them, right? And I think that is the key that is missing in so many of these situations is we assume and we just take the action instead of making the offer and seeing if that person is going to accept the offer without applying undue pressure on them. I think that's really the key. So now, of course, in our culture, there are certain things that are just kind of, they're okay, right? Just generally acceptable in our culture, right? So for instance, shaking hands, right, is generally acceptable. You're in, Latin cultures and they approach you and they kiss you on both cheeks, or when you're in LA, right? So there are different cultures where this is the norm. And I think that when something is sort of a norm like this, it's not a sexual thing, right? We're not talking about running your hand in sort of a sexual way over somebody, right? We're not talking about that. We're talking about just sort of general, shaking a hand or, patting somebody on the back or whatever. Then if you know that if that's something you don't wish to receive from others, you have the absolute right to inform them and just say, look, I'd appreciate it if you just don't touch me. I don't really like to shake hands, especially now with COVID, right? We can just express that up front in that situation and have and what we want those when we express that the other person isn't offended, that they appreciate and recognize that you have the absolute right to say that. You don't need a reason. There's just that's your prerogative, right? That's your right. And but on the other hand, for the person who maybe doesn't want to be touched, to understand that if that's sort of what happens culturally, that's the accepted norm, to ask for what they want nicely in a calm way, not immediately attacking the other person or assuming you violated me and blah 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 blah. And I was like, well, that's just the cultural norm here. What are you talking about, right? So you don't want to have that overt reaction, which some people can be triggered by, especially if they have had difficult circumstances. So it's important for both parties to recognize, okay, this is the cultural norm here. I can ask for what I want, but if someone shakes my hand or pats me on the back or something, not to have an overreaction to it if I haven't expressed to them how I wish for my body to be treated.
Right. You bring up a really interesting concept, which is the idea of don't assume too much. Don't assume that people will be offended and therefore curtail your ability to speak up for yourself. Also, don't assume that people are going to put up a fight about it. So I know it really is a balance. You're really talking about straightforward communication skills here as well.
Yes.
I think that could be another topic on our next Blab It, Paul. We may have to have Faith back a few times because, believe it or not, our hour is up.
Are you kidding me?
No, it's flown by. Faith, thank you very much for being on. I know you mentioned it earlier in your presentation, but if anybody would want to reach out to you, what's the best way to contact you?
Yeah, so here, let me share my screen with you quickly. And it'll show you where to contact me. But if you go to www.faithjones.com/legal, that's where the legal courses that I've been talking about. And if you want to email me to get access to it, it's faith@faithjones.com. So for where the business legal course is, it is faithjones.com/legal. That's how you can get to it. And I'll show you a quick look at this is the website, just so you know what it looks like. It says, how would you like to, hold on, I can't see the screen, to use the law to be prepared, protected, and more powerful in business. So that is what I am helping to arm business owners with. Be prepared, protected, and powerful. So that is the website if you wanna check that out and get more information.
Thank you, Faith, for an incredibly powerful episode of Blab It. This was a topic I'm sure not a lot of people really talk about. So this is basically business owner and employee and employer gold that you have been sharing with all of us. And we really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you.
And thank you so much for having me. One of my passions, like I said, is to help empower individuals, to help us to rise free from abuse and from discrimination, from all of the stuff that even other people, government institutions put on us, to protect ourselves and to also make sure that we do no harm to others. So that's really the core of what I teach.
All right. Well, thank you, Faith. I think we may be visiting again in the future.
All right. It was great to hang out with you and Paul, Glenn, and everybody else here watching the webinar. I'll look forward to talking to you guys again soon. Bye.
All right, everyone. See you guys same time, same place.